All right, here it is. All of you should be able to see the board now. We are using the same study as before, so you can join by logging into your lichess account. I'll send you a link to the study. Take a look at the chat and just click on the link so that you can get transferred to this study. And the plan for today is to check two games that were played by. You cannot hear me? Can the rest of you hear me? All right. Uh, well, Brighton, I think that the problem might be on your part since the rest of people can hear me. Maybe you can check your speakers to see whether the volume is up. Can you hear me now? All right, let's see now. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so it seems to be working now. Let me just share the screen. Sean, can you allow me to share the screen? I'm still not able to share.
It's maybe because only the host can share.
Oh, yes, that's why I'm waiting
So
for.
the host is like he can say, "Oh, I give you permission," and you can share.
You are right about that, Nathan. I am waiting for Sean to give me the permission as usually, but I'm not getting it. So let me give you the link to the study. Maybe Sean is away from his computer. Um, Here it is. Can all of you join the study? Great, I'm still not able to share the screen. Nicholas, can you send me your username? Maybe you weren't invited to it. So only Nicholas cannot join. What is your username on lichess, Nicholas? Okay, I'll send you an invitation now. Maybe you haven't been invited to the study previously. Here it is. Now, if you click on the link, you should be able to join. Is it working now? Excellent. So the plan for today is to check two games played by Rubinstein. You have already heard about Rubinstein, I'm sure. He was one of the strongest chess players that never actually became a world champion. His style was mainly strategic, but he also has some very interesting tactical games. We'll start with this game and the position that we have on the board. In these two games, Rubinstein showed an excellent understanding of the position, and he was able to take advantage of the opponent's weak pawn structure. So if we take a look at this position that we have on the board, what do you think about it? What is your evaluation? Who is better here and why?
I think white is better.
Yes, white is better. And why is that?
Because white has less pawn islands.
Excellent. White has only two pawn islands. Black has three. Which pawns are weak in Black's pawn structure? C6 is weak. C6 is a backward pawn. G7 is not a weak pawn. We have three types of weak pawns: isolated, doubled, and backward. C6 is backward. What else do we have? A7, excellent. A7 is an isolated pawn. Great. White has no weaknesses in his pawn structure. That's why white is better. We can notice that neither white nor black have completed their development. That's something that they still need to do. But when they complete the development, black will still be left with these weak pawns. What do you suggest now for white? Any ideas for white?
I think you should develop his bishop to like e3.
Okay, bishop e3 is the most
Wait,
logical move.
but then we'll lose our pawn beside him.
Excellent. It doesn't work because black will take the pawn. That's why we need to find something else. Black has these weak pawns. All right, let's go back to our position. Someone is moving us to the beginning of the game. Here it is. Since black has these weak pawns, they can easily become targets for white's pieces. Whenever you notice weaknesses in your opponent's position, you can consider attacking these weaknesses. They can become your targets. Another good idea is to create a blockade in order to fix these weaknesses on their squares. Then it will be easier to attack them. If queen d2, queen g5, that is too slow and black can easily defend g7. For example, black can simply castle and his pawn is fine. It will take you two moves to get your queen to g5, and black will be able to protect with only one move. Another reason why queen d2 is not good is because it blocks the diagonal for the bishop. It's not natural to place the queen in front of the bishop. If you take a look at this position and okay, so rook e1, another idea. Let's say black castles and we play e4. Now black is not forced to take. When we move the rook to e1, we weakened f2. So black can play something like this move. Knight g4. The rook is no longer protecting f2. Now if rook e2 or f1, it doesn't matter. Black can push d4. So with this move e4, white only achieved one thing, and that is to close the diagonal for his bishop. He didn't improve his position at all with this move. Now black has a passed pawn on the d file. There is one very important thing that we should know about weak pawns. Often there are some weak squares around weak pawns. Which square is weak? C5, excellent. C5 is an excellent outpost for white if he can manage to get a piece there. The backward pawn will be blocked. Excellent. Knight a4 is the move. Let's see why. The queen is now under attack, so the queen needs to move. Our knight on a4 is on the edge of the board and it's not well placed at the moment. But that is okay because that's only a temporary location for the knight. The knight will soon move to c5. What do we need to play next in order to control this weak square? Queen d4 is not the best. White's priority should be to develop the bishop. So it's much better to play bishop e3. Now the pawn on b2 is protected. If you play queen d4, black can continue with something like queen e2, taking your pawn. So you did achieve the control of c5, but you lost a pawn. Much better is to play bishop e3. After this move, black simply castled. What do you suggest next? All right, so if you play a3 followed by b4, you are allowing Black to get rid of one of his weaknesses. He has two weak pawns. Which one can he trade and get rid of? Yes, so Black can push a5 and eliminate one of his weaknesses. That's why this idea of pushing the queenside pawns is not the best. These pawns can become targets for Black's weak ones. What instead? How can White improve his position? Do you have any ideas? Which pieces can be improved? Two moves that make sense here for White are Rook c1 or Queen c2. Both of these moves put pressure on the weak c6 pawn. It definitely makes sense to place the rook on a half-open file, and that is what White played in the game. Now Black continued with his development, attacking the pawn on e2. What do you suggest now for White? Rook e1 is a good idea, but it is a bit passive. We don't want to play Rook e1 unless we absolutely have to. We would much rather have the rook somewhere on an open or a half-open file. The rook on e1 has mainly a defensive role, so that's not the best move. Any other ideas? In the game, f3 was played. But f3 is not the best move because it closes the diagonal of the bishop and also it weakens e3. It was much better to play rook e1. The best move was queen c2. Let's see why. Now, if black continues with bishop takes, he will lose material and then the game. Excellent. Knight c3 is a fork. So, if black wants to take, the only way to do it is with the queen. What is the most logical continuation now for white? Any ideas? Queen takes. Excellent. This is a very good position for white. Black still has two weaknesses. Now he has two isolated pawns, and white's pieces are very active. So queen c2 was the most active way for white to continue in this position. Instead, he played f3. When we have a better pawn structure, it makes sense to trade pieces because as we approach the endgame, our opponent's pawns will become even weaker. So how should white continue here? Knight c5 is also a good move. In the game, bishop c5 was played, but this move makes sense as well. It does allow black to take here, but that's not that big of a deal because we can take and take on c6, attacking the pawn on e6. The knight is well placed on c5, occupying this weak square. In the game, bishop c5 was played. The idea is to trade bishops in order to bring the game closer to the endgame and then occupy c5 with the knight. So the idea is to get the knight to c5, but to first trade bishops. Black continued with protecting the bishop with the rook. If a bishop takes instead, we can recapture and have an excellent position. Now, white played a very unusual move, rook f2. Why was this move played? What do you think? At first sight, the rook is quite awkward on f2. It doesn't seem to be well placed. But what is the idea? White has a very interesting plan. He wants to push e3 and then bring the rook to the other side of the board, possibly double on the c file. That is White's plan. Black continued with knight d7, putting pressure on the c5 bishop. How should White respond? b4 is not the best move. How can Black continue after b4? It is something that we mentioned. Do you remember? When we push this pawn forward, we give Black the possibility to play a5 and trade his weak pawn. When these two pawns get traded, it's only a matter of time when this will happen. Black gets rid of his isolated pawn that's weak, and White gets an isolated pawn. The pawn on a2 in that case becomes isolated. So after the trade, Black will have one weak pawn less, and White will have one weak pawn more. So b4 is not the best. In the game, White traded bishops and played queen d4 to still control the weak square c5. Notice how White has these two excellent squares for his pieces. These pawns cannot protect dark squares, so White can freely use them. Black retreated the rook to e8. Take a look at White's position at the moment. Which two pieces are not doing that much? Great, the rook and the bishop. Both can be improved by pushing the pawn to e3. White started with bishop f1. The idea is to push e3. And queen b7. What do you suggest now for white? Knight c5 was played in the game. Excellent. Another move that deserved attention was great. Rook c2. Both these moves are perfectly fine for white. A Rubinstein choice was knight c5. After this move, black traded, and again white got the control of c5. Rook c7. Black is preparing a rook c8 if necessary, so that he can protect this weak pawn. A rook c2 now. How should white continue? There are two quite logical moves here. Do you have any ideas? One of the moves that white can consider is bishop d3. This move makes sense because white improves the position of his bishop. The bishop is better placed on d3 than on f1. The move played in the game was b4. We talked about this move on some other occasions, and we said that it's not that good because of a5. Why is a5 not possible right now? Rook d5, queen takes d4. What is your idea next? Pawn takes. The problem with this variation is that a2 is now quite weak and hanging. So when black protects the back rank checkmate, he will be able to take that pawn. So now if you take on c6, you lose the pawn on a2. White no longer has advantage here. What instead of rook d5? Notice that there is a pin on the C file. How can you use it? Any ideas? White can simply push b5, threatening the pawn on c6. Black cannot take because of the pin on the rook. Now black is in a very difficult position. That's why black chose a6 here. Rook a5. Black has two weak pawns, and white is attacking both of them. Rook d8. Should white take on a6 and allow black to take on b4? Is that a good trade for white? What do you think? In that case, white would be trading his healthy pawn for black's weak one, so it's not good for him. The best move is a3. Our pawn is safe and black still has problems protecting the pawn. Let's find the winning tactic here. How should white continue? If queen e5, how does this move win the game for white? I mean, Will you get any material? If, for example, let's say bishop d7, there is no continuation now that wins material for white. There is something else. Any ideas? White has a very interesting tactical idea. Rook takes c6. Now, if black recaptures, white will take the rook on a7. So with this combination, white won a pawn. Now the rook on b8 is under attack, as well as the pawn on a6. So black continued with rook a8. The queen needs to move. Where would you go with the queen? When we have a better pawn structure, we want to trade pieces. Also, trading is good for white because he's a pawn up. Black, of course, should avoid that. King f2. This move improves the position of the king slightly. It is closer to the center since we are in an endgame, let's say. The queens are still on the board, but they might get traded quite soon. The king is also protecting e3, which is one of the pawns that are slightly shaky for white. Now black continued with a5. It's quite hard to find a good move for black. His pieces are tied down to defending these weak pawns. That is the problem with having weak pawns. You have to be on the defensive all the time. Your pieces will have to protect these pawns, so they'll be quite passive. White now simply improved the position of the bishop. What do you suggest next for white? So black has weak pawns. These pawns are excellent targets. Can white maybe make sure that he can win any of these two pawns? And he can put another attacker on a6. Now this pawn is attacked 3 times by the queen, rook, and the bishop, and black is only protecting it twice. If he decides to bring another defender, he will lose the pawn on d5. There is no way for him to defend a6. So he played simply queen c8. Now, the best move for white was, of course, to take here. Black doesn't have any counterplay along the c file. This rook cannot threaten any of white's pawns or pieces. But for some reason, Rubinstein decided to play rook c5 and then h4. Now black went for a5. This is just a desperate attempt to counterattack. How should white continue after this move? Rook takes is excellent. And this position is rather easy for white to win. He has a passed pawn on the a file that's quite well supported by the bishop and the queen. If black continues with something like this, we have ways to remove this queen. Something like this makes sense. So taking the pawn on a5 was a good idea. Instead of that, white played rook c7, followed by b5. Again, white has a passed pawn. a4. What next? Any suggestions? Since white has a passed pawn, he should simply push it forward. Now black continued with rook a5 and b7. At this point, black resigned the game. He had two weak pawns that resulted in losing the game. It's very hard to play this position for black. If he plays something like this to attack this pawn and threaten to capture it, white has a very strong tactical continuation. Let's try to find it. There are two different ideas actually here that win the game. There are two piece sacrifices that win the game. You need to sacrifice something here. Any ideas? Rook c8 is one of the moves. Let's see why. If black takes with the bishop, we win by taking on b8. If black moves the king, we simply win the queen, or we can even give a checkmate. There is a forced checkmate here. And the last option that we have left is queen takes. But here we win the queen and we have material advantage. Excellent. This is one of the sacrifices. The second one is to take the bishop. Let's see why. Now, if pawn takes, rook c8 wins the game. White is simply a piece up. He has this passed pawn as well. If instead of taking the queen, black takes this rook, what is the winning move? Queen e8 works as well, and then promoting. But you can also play here and force the trade of queens and also the promotion. That's why black resigned the game. This game is an excellent example how we can use our opponent's weaknesses in the pawn structure. Weak pawns can be good targets for us. Also, remember that around weak pawns, we might find weak squares that we can use as well. We'll leave the other game that Rubinstein played for the next time. It's A very instructive endgame, actually. Do you have any questions about the game that we checked today? I assume there are no questions, okay? In that case, I'll see you next week, same time, guys. Have a good week. Bye.
Bye.